Now I'm going to present you some Monsieur Michel Foucault, okay, born in 1926, rather an old guy, and died in 1984. Okay, that was an interesting one, actually. Scholars, I don't know, I am not sure about it, but scholars, especially the guy, and they are good at it, Stephen Best and Douglas Kellner, okay? Scholars consider Michel Foucault's theoretical contributions can be divided up to perhaps three different periods, you know. The first one, the earlier period, is usually referred as his archaeological period, or the period of his archaeological thinking and theorizing. Later on, he passed on to another stage in his thinking, which is called genealogical period. Okay, and then finally, he once again shifted. Okay, as being loyal to what he said already, that at where you look for me, you will never find. Okay, so just like this. Okay, this time we find a different Michel Foucault. Okay, if you take a look at his writings, especially later writings, you'll find out that he would say continuously that he didn't shift his topic, neither his topic nor his approach. But as these scholars had pointed out in these differences, and I agree with them, it's difficult to say that what we are trying to consider as one man actually here, shifting his positions, so to speak. Okay, so contrary to what he says, if you ask me, he shifted through and through, made shifts in his positions. Okay, as this early period, I can enumerate several works by him, especially scattered during the 1960s. For instance, in 1961, there comes first influential book by Michel Foucault, Madness and Civilization. You know, there's a not so good Turkish translation in the market here. And then in 1963, he published another important book titled The Birth of the Clinic, An Archaeology of Medical Perception. Okay. And in 1966, The Order of Things, and finally in 1971, The Archaeology of Knowledge. Okay, you know, you see, this is why these works are usually called archaeology, archaeological. And what does it mean here in this context, archaeology? I'm gonna try to crack it to you. But yeah, okay. Let's start with this. Okay. You know, the year is 1961. What we have before us, either modern alternatives, Marxism being still strongly influential, but Althusser is about to come into the picture as an influential figure within Marxism and exploding Marxist thinking, actually at least intellectual Marxist thinking on the one hand. And you know, Althusser was familiar with theories developed by Freud, Lacan, etc., and had been introduced them to French academia and French thinking so far. And Michel Foucault as well was one of those who were protected by Louis Althusser and so on, and operating in this. Now, Madness and Civilization, the first work. What's at stake is actually, it's a surprising book, actually. When you read Michel Foucault, you come to like his style, okay? It's not something usual in social sciences. All those boring styles, repeating the same spiritless sentences, so to speak, okay? But the book opens up with a description of the ship of fools, okay? Creating a quite beautiful literary effect, actually, okay? So You have been introduced into a book with the title Madness and Civilization, and the opening chapter is about the ship of fools, okay? And Foucault introduces that idea of the exclusion of the fool at a certain historical period in the West, okay, out of the society. Okay, suddenly, not suddenly, within a couple of, within a half a century, so to speak, okay, the fool, the concept of the fool, you know, that very familiar concept of the fool, the village fool, for instance, or the fool at the king's court, you know, had been recognized as, yeah, as kind of both a curse of God and at the same time a gift given by God, you know that village fool. Nobody likes to be like him. Nobody wants to frequent association with him, strong associations with him, but everybody somehow, while at the same time trying to keep a distance away from him, at the same time showing a respect for him. Okay? Simply because the fool, that village fool or the fool clown in King's Court, okay, was the only one, as they are considered in those times, according to Foucault, was the only one who had the privilege of telling the truth. Okay? And look at, the king is naked. Okay? It was only the fool who had the courage to say the truth, so to speak. Okay? So suddenly, it says, within a run of a half a century, okay, this conceptualization of the fool had been replaced, and the fool increasingly began to be defined under a new concept, the mad rather than fool, okay, and no longer wanted to wander around in society, okay. And the ship of fools, Narrenschiff, as far as I remember, it's German term, okay, was a certain ship where a town, for instance, collect all those who were considered to be mad, not acting in accordance with reason, so to speak, okay? Collect them together and get them on board on a certain ship and let the ship sail towards an unknown destiny. Okay? So they were considered to be God's children yet, and hoped that God would protect his own children. Okay? So we don't want them here, okay, but they are still God's children. So let them be collected and put into a ship together and let God do whatever he wants to do with them. Okay? Now, this history discussed in that book as the history of the formation of the reason in contradistinction to a completely new concept, madness, unreason. Okay? Madness this time understood that unreason. Okay? So that was the major import of the book, actually trying to trace the development of a certain concept, reason, very important concept, reason, in opposition to a counter concept which has been produced, both of them being produced into this counter-positing against each other. Okay? So, according to this argument, then, okay, there was no such conception, a modern conception as reason, prior to this development, as well as there was no such modern concept of the mad, okay, unreason. That was a very crucial point in those times, even though nowadays it has been a commonplace argument, perhaps, but the very acceptedness and acceptability of this argument owes its power to that. Okay? So therefore that was important, and in 1963 there comes the birth of the clinic, what it was, an archaeology of medical perception. Okay? Again, a similar procedure had been applied here. Okay? Foucault was trying to show the development of the modern medical gaze. Okay? again presenting us with a pre-modern medical methods and approach to treatment, and later on how this changed, how a modern, really modern concept of diagnosis come into the picture, how body is conceptualized, and how the medical gaze began to look at the symptoms of the sicknesses in this body, okay? I'm not going to go into the details of these books, but let me point out this. What he was trying through these two books were, first of all, to overcome the limitations of, on the one hand, actually three limitations prevalent at that time, okay? On the first, okay, let's start with this. The history of ideas. Who conceived the development of thought, human understanding, as an unbreached, uninterrupted, continuous process. So, according to this, you know, it's one point in history, some idea began to develop and gradually acquiring maturity and giving way to the flourishment of other ideas. Okay? So the development of consciousness, therefore, well, can easily be understood as a continuous and cumulative process. You know, our knowledge, the ancient Greeks knew that much, but based upon their knowledge, the others contributed to the existing stock of knowledge, and today we know much more than the ancient Greeks knew. Okay, but if theirs were the starting point, now ours is the culminating point. Okay, so our knowledge is based upon their knowledge as a result of kind of accumulation. Okay. So history of ideas, against history of ideas, and against structuralism. You know, the basic danger of structuralism was to think of the structures in terms of an underlying one single structure. For instance, in Levi-Strauss' writings, this points to the direction of the structuring capacity, structured and structuring capacity of the human mind. Okay, one single structure structuring all the other structures, which means, okay, and ultimately, as you can see, this was Levi-Strauss' position was quite a Kantian one, simply because one structuring human mind, having its own structure, was a Kantian idea, as you remember. Okay. The Kantian consciousness was structured consciousness and structuring everything according to itself. No? So therefore, quite Kantian idea. And this was dangerous. You know. First of all, as we have seen in the earlier discussions, it has been increasingly apparent that what we are talking as structure is always and all the time, unfortunately perhaps, is far from being a complete structure. In other words, as somebody, I don't know who right now, expressed this situation as follows, okay? A structure leaks from everywhere, okay? So, you know, remember, for instance, that basic problem, you know, the value of the sign in a signifying chain, etc. The problem is that, as Lacan has successfully shown actually, the problem is that in the relationship of the signifier and the signified, you know, that bar I was talking about last time, okay? The signifier can never penetrate into the signified, he was saying. Rather, the act of significance rather than signification, okay, occurs when the signifier refers always to the other signifiers, okay? You know, it was already hidden in the original formula. The value of the sign is the difference of that sign from the other signs in a signifying chain. This very formula showing us that actually the sign has nothing to do with the signified, okay? But rather with the other signs. The problem with the other signs, its relationship with the other signs, okay? So, And the character of sign, within the structure of the sign, the priority now this time had been given to the signifier rather than the signified, simply because, as you know, we could not able to make such supposition. Otherwise, we would find ourselves in the position that we have thoughts without language. Okay? It would mean that if there are signifieds independent of signifier, it would simply mean that prior to language, we had our thoughts. And language is nothing than an instrument to express those thoughts. Okay? Now I am sticking loyal to the structuralist position, and the conclusion is that within the structure of the sign, the priorities should be given to the signifier, not to the signified. Okay? And signifier, what signifier? The signifier is nothing else than a difference from other signifiers, which means that a signifier continuously refers to the other signifiers. The result, a signifier always proliferates other signifiers. Okay? Now, this means that the structure can never be complete, actually always in the process of formation, and therefore always lacking that peculiar unity that would enable us, why this is important? It would enable us simply because to establish a more or less, at least little bit, holding relationship between the signifier and the signified. Okay? But if signifier refers to other signifiers and the signifiers continue to proliferate, this means that the signifier and the relationship between the signifier and the signified always is floating. Okay? Which means that a signifier would never pin down a certain meaning in a fixed sense. Okay? So one should be careful when approaching to structuralism. Okay? So against that original proposition, which was especially prevalent in those structuralists, implying the existence of a structure laying beneath all the observable structures and informing them, okay? Now a certain precaution should be taken, okay? So against structuralism. And lastly, against hermeneutics. We have already talked about this, especially in the case of a later writing of Ronald Barthes, you know. The idea is the same, okay, here. You know, when we are talking about the possibility of hermeneutics, it's almost contrary to the claims of post-structuralism, so to speak. The basic claim is the existence of a meaning in a text. Let alone that intrinsic relationship between that meaning and the author of the text. Okay? You know, text gotta be written by somebody, some author. And the author and the meaning should somehow intrinsically, very closely be related with each other. You know, when I ask you, for instance, what do you think about that or this matter, you will give me an answer, okay? And I would take that answer as if this answer is your very internal meaning. Now, the suggestion was that we don't give a shit about what you really try to mean, okay? Actually, what's important, what you are able to say in a given situation, okay? What you personally try to mean, nobody cares about. Actually, there can't be no such possibility. As we have seen, what you call as very your own unconscious or imago, regardless of whether, however, it could be fantastic or whatever, okay, it is your own in the ultimate analysis. And it has been shown that, contrary to what you think, it is not your internality, but rather your externality. We are sorry. Okay? Even your unconscious is speaking the language of the other. Huh? The other, with big other in Lacan's sense, okay? The other, the language of the society, if you like, okay? So you are not speaking, in other words. Okay, language is speaking, text itself speaking, okay? Being not a property of yours, being not an instrument of yours, awaiting there to be used at your wish when you want to express your own internal meaning or whatever. It has been said already that language is that which constructs, produces meanings, okay? The producer of the meanings is not the individual subject any longer, okay? It's the language. So, therefore, when Foucault enters into the scene, what he was trying to do is to develop a position which would not fall into these three perspectives. Okay? So actually, that stage I could easily interpret Foucault's work as post-structuralist. Okay? And archaeology here meaning the digging out of those common unconscious elements laying hidden in a given discourse. Okay? For instance, in the first book, Madness and Civilization, the discourse of reason is under question. Okay? What discourse of reason is producing, contrary to what all those producers of this discourse were saying, okay? What really this discourse itself is producing in history, okay? The reason in contradistinction to madness. It is producing the rational individual human being, actually, okay? By separating itself with madness. On the other one, in the following work, the same applies. The new modern body under the newly developed clinical gaze, medical clinical gaze. Clinic had been introduced in that work as the institution of the modern medical gaze, okay? And then under the interrogation of this case, what the text discusses is the constitution, the very process of the constitution of the modern body, so to speak, okay? Actually, as you see, these two works are complementary. One is dealing with the modern consciousness, modern reason. The other one is dealing with the problems of the constitution of the modern body, okay? And then a later work, in 1966, actually it's a very important, almost I should say, epoch-making work. Okay, there comes The Order of Things. Order of Things is an interesting word from several perspectives. First of all, Order of Things challenges knowledge itself. Okay, you know, up until those times, 1960s, so to speak, all the scholars, all the academy, all those who think about these matters, write about these matters, tend to think that, okay, whatever it is, in the ultimate analysis, we are talking about human knowledge. We are talking about human knowledge here in the society. They were talking about human knowledge some 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece. We are talking about the same thing. You know? What did they say at that time, being still important for our discussions? Okay, and our discussions still being some bearing, having some bearing for the discussions of somebody else living in another country around the same topic. We are talking about human knowledge. And when we say human knowledge, you know, come on, it's something universal. Even though we may come to reject the grounds of that universality supplied by the Kantian conceptualization of a universal consciousness, come on, man, we are in the ultimate analysis, are all human beings, okay? We are all capable of thinking, capable of observing, capable of developing judgments of knowledge together. How far could they be different from each other? Even though, okay, it may be said that after Hegel there are historical a prioris rather than let's reject the Kantian proposition that human species sharing, partaking in the same structure of consciousness, enabling them to know things similar ways, okay? You know, the introduction of that idea was quite revolutionary in its own time. But at the same time, on the other hand, you may remember it has destructive effects of its own, okay? If we really adopt that perspective, it means that, yeah, we may be human beings altogether, but a human being living in a primitive society with quite primitive level of consciousness compared to mine. So, and the result is my expectancy that this primitive human being should follow my example. Well, we are not equal any longer. I am at the better stage in the history of the development of consciousness. Okay, then we began to eliminate. After the destruction of that unitary, progressive, unilinear, whatever teleological conception of history, then we can easily get rid of the dangerous results of the introduction of that concept. You know, everything turns out to be relative. Nothing becomes better than any other, so on and so forth. Okay, everything almost should be handled in its own uniqueness, so to speak. Okay, simply because there can't be any progress, which means that there can't be any retrogress either. So progressiveness and retrogress, you know, İttihat Terakki, ilerlemeci. Progressiveness or retrospectiveness does not matter any longer. Okay? So we can easily take back this idea into the picture. What happens when I take this back into the picture in terms of knowledge, however? Okay, ideas, as I told you, are not neutral things, and I'm now introducing this idea into your continuously accumulating conceptualization of history of knowledge. Say ancient Greece, Middle Ages, okay, Rome, Middle Ages, Renaissance, Enlightenment, modernity. And we are at the threshold of the end of modernity, here in 1966. Okay, what happens? Now I'm going to introduce this tiny little piece of idea into that schema. What do you think will happen? First of all, the very destruction, nothing else than the very destruction of that continuity. Okay? There are no continuities any longer. Rather, the introduction of the idea of discontinuity or breaks in history. We have seen this idea had already been introduced in Altuzar's teacher. You have not seen. We are going to see it in another course. Gaston Bachelard. Okay. Then Altuzar adopted the idea. It was 1930s, 38 actually, when Gaston Bachelard published his book. Okay, Altuzar was his student. So when we proceed to the 1950s, the idea was already there. Okay, the history must be thought in terms of discontinuities rather than continuities. Okay? So, actually, when you try to think about history in terms of discontinuities, you'll find out this idea quite handy. Okay? This idea is the very tool that you, by making use of it, you divide, breach down the continuities within history. Okay. Why? Simply because now I introduce that, okay, even though in these different epochs or periods of time, okay, people were still talking about knowledge, what they were talking about as knowledge were different in each and every case. Why? Simply because their historical a prioris are different. Okay? What we were talking actually about is the exact conditions of possibility of forming discursive knowledge. Okay? Or if you like, better said, discourses of knowledge. Let me put it here. It's a Kantian term. Conditions of possibility of forming a discourse of knowledge. You might think that when you were thinking history as a continuous process, continuous and cumulative process, you might think that what conditions of possibility? Whatever they are already given from the very beginning. Okay? But Hegelian analysis has shown us that they were not there from the very beginning. Okay? They were generated as a result of historical processes. Okay? So if these conditions of possibilities, when we say conditions of possibilities, we are talking about the a prioris, talking about the historical a prioris. You know, a priori meaning, for instance, I observe here a board marker. Okay? Now, my observation of my seeing of this board marker is right now taking place. Okay? But for me to be able to see this thing and recognize it as board marker, something prior to this actual experience of seeing it is required. This is what we mean by a priori. Okay? Now this time, however, we are not talking about historical, absolute a prioris, but rather historical. Historical meaning here, prior to this event, prior to my seeing this, okay, and recognizing it as a board marker. Okay? For instance, a couple of days ago, okay, I should have been introduced with this new kind of board rather than that classical blackboard, okay? And I should be introduced with the idea of inscribing on that board with something else rather than chalk, piece of chalk, okay? Otherwise, I wouldn't know what this was, okay? So these are required for me to have been acquired a certain knowledge of prior to my being able to recognize this object as particular that object. Okay? That is that simple. That's why historical a prioris are nothing else than the conditions of possibility of forming a certain discourse of knowledge. Okay? So Foucault sets to analyze, conduct an analysis of this, okay? He divides the post-Renaissance period into three different periods, phrases, okay? From 1666 to, let me see, not to confuse them, let me check it out, 1800s, actually, and from 1800 to 1950, and then Okay. So Renaissance and 1660, yes, second half of the 17th century and 19th century, 17th century say, and 19th century up to the first part of the, including the first part of the 20th century. And he claims that the conditions of possibility of knowledge in these three different periods were different from each other. Okay. The basic idea is this. Now, to be able to show this, actually, he develops a certain concept, episteme, around which he organizes what he calls the elements of the collective unconscious available in the discourses generated at a given historical period. Okay. You know, again, Freudian and Lacanian psychology turns out to be effective here. Okay, and you have a certain discourse of the scientists. Okay. You are studying a certain field in science, the texts, what the scientists had written about it, and you are, in those texts, you are not taking the face value what the scientists say, but rather trying to pin down, find out what actually such texts, what are the rules according to which such texts are organized, okay? What important elements the texts are hiding, for what reason, and what certain elements the texts themselves producing through what mechanisms. Okay, let's have a break.